So essentially what I'm going to be talking about is the demographic context for social connectedness. I'm also going to talk a little bit about the economic trends, since as Melanie mentioned, the workplace is such an important place for social connections, both where they're made and that are impacted by social connectedness. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank my funders for the support that they give Minnesota Compass. It allows us to come to events like this and give presentations. It also provides the website and the data information on the site. I want to say too, Paul said a special thank you, but I want to look at say thanks to Blue Cross Blue Shield and also the Bush Foundation, who are our partners for today. So on Minnesota Compass's site, we have data about the Twin Cities region. We have 7 regions technically on the Compass site. The majority of you will be interested in the Twin Cities. If you're looking on the city level, we also have data about 44 different cities in the region. We show a couple of the profiles right there, but there are a lot more data on the site. And so we're going to play a little bit of a game here, so I want to get people engaged and shouting even. We're going to do a where do you stand? So is the Twin Cities region higher or lower than the state of Minnesota for these demographic trends? Let's do the first one. Age 65 and older, it's 13% in the state. What do folks think? Is it higher or lower in the Twin Cities? It's actually 11%, so we have fewer. We're not aging as fast as the rest of the state is, and we'll talk about that in a second. How about persons of color? Yeah, all right. That's nearly 1 in 4 of residents in the Twin Cities region are of color. Foreign-born residents? Yeah, that's right, higher. Below poverty, we have about the same. So some of these trends, I want to point out, some of these trends for the state are really driven by the Twin Cities region, but for the share who are below poverty, it's about the same. How about the proportion of adults working? Lower share, I'm hearing lower, and it's about the same again. I didn't really give you guys that option, but sorry about that. How about those who don't have health insurance? We heard a lot about connectedness. Okay, same. All right, that was good. You guys had a decent sense of what's going on in the Twin Cities region on that. One of the first things we're going to talk about, as Melanie mentioned, is aging. I know there's a lot of information right now about the aging demographic. Actually, I just saw something about the UN and talking about the graying, how the entire world is graying. But when we look at it for the Twin Cities, we're seeing that the aging demographic is more severe and outstate. So what we're looking at right here is the share of the population that is 65 plus, older adults in 2010. And so right now we're looking at 22 counties that have a higher share of older adults. But by 2030, we're going to have 69 counties that will have, we're projected, I should say, to have 69 counties that will have more than 20% of their population who are 65 plus. Now that has major implications for our state, even for our region. So we're seeing that the Twin Cities has fewer, they're still gray, but they're not that far off of 20%. Most of those counties are about 17, 18, 19. And what's more, our region operates within the state, the context of the state. And so when we think about things like the geography of aging, and we'll talk later in the economic section a bit about worker shortage, where those workers will be needed that might pull from the Twin Cities are in the outer regions. And that question of connectedness is definitely impacted by the share of aging population. As Melanie mentioned, we have the question of continuing to keep connections among the aging population, avoiding the idea of shut-ins or folks who aren't able to have as much mobility. So that's going to be a really big issue for those of us who care a lot about that question of social connectedness. Another way that we look at this is just the ratio of retirement age population, again, that's 65 plus, and the school age population. And in the Twin Cities, it says already outnumbered. That's not actually right. We don't already outnumber, but in 2025, the school age population for the first time in the region's history will be lower than the 65 plus population. In the state, that's going to happen in 2020. So again, we're not going quite as fast. And part of the reason why dovetails into the next section I'm going to talk about, which is diversity. And we, in the Twin Cities, we're fortunate to have a strong segment of younger folks who are of color. And so the younger population is increasingly of color, and that's kind of why we're seeing that delay in this trend here. So next I'm going to talk about diversity. The Twin Cities has nearly twice the share of residents of color in any other region. We talked about that 24% number. It's actually, it's a bit higher in the central cities. I'm wondering if anybody can guess, among the cities in the 7-county metro, who has the highest share of population of color? I hear St. Paul. Anyone else? Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park are actually number 1 and number 2. And then we have St. Paul and Minneapolis next. So way to go, folks. So we're seeing, too, that trend that I think, you know, conceptually we imagine the central cities to have the higher share, and it's really shifting quite a bit. So we have 1 in 4 folks in the Twin Cities who are of color. This has really increased dramatically, and we can see in a number of ways that this is the future of the region. The Black and Asian population in the Twin Cities has actually tripled since 1990, and the Hispanic population has quadrupled. Now, this has a big impact on what the future of the region will look like, what connectedness looks like, as we have an increased share of populations of color. As Melanie mentioned, those questions of linking and bonding are different for each of these cultural communities. So how are we, as the programs that care about these, changing or tweaking our programs to match that? The population change by race, I always find this one really interesting. We actually, in the Twin Cities, all of the growth that we see, which in the central cities it's almost totally flatlined, but all of the growth that we see in the region is due to populations of color. And as we know, there's a very large segment that are foreign-born. This is a breakdown of the different foreign-born populations. And of course, the foreign-born question and connectedness is even more strong. The trends are even different within each of the communities. You know, when we break down the different regions that folks come from, people connect in different ways. Those family ties are much stronger. And we know that especially in these multi-generational communities, when we look at not just the foreign-born, but their children, within that multi-generational dynamic, the question of connectedness comes up. You know, does being connected to, if you're an older adult who's foreign-born, is that story the same as somebody who's that foreign-born adult's granddaughter or great-granddaughter? Probably not, but there's still an element of identity with that cultural community. So what do those shifts mean as the foreign-born community has multiple generations? How does that impact connectedness? One place where we'll really see these trends of both aging and diversity come together is in the economy. So I'm going to take a second to look at this. How is the economy in the Twin Cities? I feel like every time I open the paper, it's a different story. But what do you guys think? Is it same as it's always been, pretty good, pretty bad, or some other way? One thing we can say pretty confidently is that the economy in the Twin Cities is changing. Yeah. The job count is still down from the peak in 2007. So we're seeing actually that the region has had a net loss of 52,000 jobs. These are the places where connections are made, or where you get the fewer jobs that are there, you're able to kind of get your foot in the door, as Melanie mentioned, and it's tighter than it has been. One of the positive things is within the Twin Cities region, every county has had an increase in jobs since a year ago. When we look at the city level breakdown, so that's the 7 counties. When we look at the city level breakdown, 3 out of 4 have seen increases in their number of jobs, a net increase. And you can actually go to the Compass website, which I know you all wrote down because I saw you do it. You can go to the Compass website and see if your city has increased or decreased in its jobs. I want to just see, what are the 4 largest industries in the Twin Cities? Can somebody name the first one? 14% of jobs in the Twin Cities are in healthcare. How about the next? It's actually retail trade. Yeah, and we see 11% in manufacturing and 8% in education. I want to point out that the Twin Cities has a far more diverse industry mix than what we've seen in other regions. We did a presentation in Duluth and then one in Rochester, and so that's the Northland region and then Southern. And they're far more concentrated in one area or the next. And so the Twin Cities has a benefit of having this industry mix, but it can also make some things a little bit complicated, like knowing which sector to really invest in, and this idea of connectedness and where the growth will be. So we should develop the networks within those industries. We're seeing that healthcare, of course, we all know this is going to increase by about 24%. Manufacturing is down. You know, the hardship there is that those are generally good paying jobs for low skill, and education will increase. Knowing where the industries will be in the next, by 2019 helps us think about where should we start developing the connections in the economic sense. The aging dynamic is going to impact the way that our workers and our retirees relate to one another. Right now, we have, in the Twin Cities region, we have 6 workers for every 1 retiree. Now that means that the contributions of those 6 workers are supporting the 1 retiree with things like Social Security and other, road infrastructure. I mean, it's that sort of dynamic. But in 20 years, because of the aging changes that we'll see, that ratio is going to be 3 to 1. Now what that means is we're asking those 3 workers to be as productive as 6 workers today. Do we have the connections to do that yet? I'm not sure. If we have the educational system, or if folks are involved, we're seeing that connection to caring adults is different across race groups and income categories. I think we need to start asking ourselves if we have the social connections to do this in the educational system. It's a big question for our region and for our state. This is, I think, another dynamic that feeds into it. So of the top metros in the nation, we have a high share of adults who are working. In fact, one of the highest. And when we look, this is our metropolitan region. When we look at the share of younger adults who are educated and working, it's also very high. But we have a very dismal employment gap between white and black residents in the Twin Cities. In fact, we're at the bottom of the metropolitan regions. So we're at the top overall and at the bottom for white and black employment gap. So when we look at our future, we looked at where did the population grow the most, or where did all of our population growth come from? Communities of color. And we're not seeing that we're able to really involve communities of color in the employment sector the same way that we are having success in the white non-Hispanic population. So those are some major questions for the folks here today who care about connectedness. This is to add to this question about bachelor's degrees and educational attainment to meet the economic demands of the state. There's a study by Georgetown that says, by 2018, 68% of jobs in the state of Minnesota are going to require some level of secondary education. And so we need to ramp up our current education system and our college degrees in order to meet the needs of the growing economy. So what's the future of the Twin Cities region, and how does that connect with social connectedness? I'd say the aging population is living longer and healthier, and we look at that in a lot of ways as a strength, because those folks who are healthier than we've ever had an aging population before will be able to continue to contribute to our economy, but also to the connectedness question. Maybe there's room for mentor programs with the aging adults that we'll have in the community. But it also increases pressure on support care systems like healthcare. Well, that in turn will grow the industry of healthcare, but we need to make sure that there's the network and the connections between people in order to have those job opportunities go to all of the Twin Cities residents. So with that, minnesotacompass.org, write it down. And there are these key measures here. I'll show you: diabetes, obesity, healthcare coverage, and mental health admissions. Those are some of our most healthcare related, but I'll also recommend that you explore some of the other topics to try and understand a bit more of the context of the work that you're doing.